We're starting a new teaching series this morning, and this series is going to start from today, and it's going to run right the way through until March the 24th. March the 24th, I'm going to take a 1-week break to turn 40, and then I'm going to come back and do something different. Is that okay? And I'm going to come back post-40 with like tons of wisdom, because that's what people are telling me happens when you turn 40. If you guys have different experiences, just help me out with that a little bit. And so that's what we're doing. We're here. I'm going to run through this series right through until the 24th. Jesus was an impressive communicator. I don't know if you noticed this, but this is a lot of the time when we talk about Jesus, we are talking about things he said. And everybody in the Western context actually has to have some sort of category within which they place the communication of Jesus. Whether you're a religious person or an irreligious person, whether you're, maybe indifferent to religion or anti-religion, you will have thoughts in the Western world about Jesus and what you think of him. He's not someone we can ignore. And it's not just what he did, but what he said. Think about how many of the things that Jesus said you can drop in modern conversation. Walk into your work and talk about a Good Samaritan, a story of Jesus that you can talk about in your normal context of life, because these stories of Jesus, things that Jesus said, have kind of worked their way into our society. And so I want to talk about that throughout this series. This is what we're going to immerse ourselves in. It's an incredible privilege for me always to be able to take time and say, let's just talk about the stories of Jesus. And I want to begin in the story in Mark's Gospel today in chapter 4. Mark sets the scene up really well for us. It says again, verse 1, again Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake, while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. And he taught them many things. So just let Mark immerse you in this scene for a moment. He's going to some trouble to paint the picture for you. He wants you to get a bit of a vibe as to what this was like and what was going on in this particular situation. Jesus attracts crowds, right? You notice this from the Gospels, right? Jesus attracts crowds. Jesus doesn't go somewhere and there's like 2 people going, let's see what this guy's got going on. Like crowds come. Fascinating thing about Jesus, these crowds, is they're so diverse. The responses of people that turn up to see Jesus are really, really different. Some people love Jesus. Some people hate Jesus, and they want to kill him. But Jesus had this remarkable ability that whether you loved him or hated him, you turned up to see what he was going to say. And Jesus is in this situation where there's all these people, and he creates this moment where he jumps into a boat and he kind of gets himself a little bit away from the shore, and the people line up along the shore. This is quite clever, actually, because your voice carries better over water. So Jesus uses nature as if he knows nature well. I'll let you think about that in your own time. And he uses nature to allow his voice to carry better so that more people can hear him. The people are gathered round. Some of them are, they're so close because they want to hear what Jesus has to say. They're right up to the edge of the shore. The water is getting their feet in that kind of sandy, gross way that happens when you go to the beach. Imagine yourself in this situation. Imagine you were there on this day. Just put yourself there for a moment. Close your eyes or use your brain, however it is that you do these things. And Jesus is going to talk. He taught them many things. Here's a mental exercise for you just now. What is Jesus saying? Like if you're there right now, what is it that comes to mind when you imagine being part of this particular story? What is Jesus talking about? Like if you've come through a lot of religious traditions, oftentimes our thoughts about Jesus is that he spent a lot of time just walking around telling you what to do or not to do. Sometimes, like, I had experience of this when I was growing up in the church. People would say, so you're a Christian, what does that mean? And we would immediately start to roll off a list of things we couldn't do, which said something about our understanding about what it was that we were doing. Oh yeah, we're Christians, so we don't do this, we don't do that, we don't do the next thing. It wasn't the best sales effort we ever could have made. Perhaps you think about some of the things you know that Jesus said, and perhaps you imagine him saying them. What's fascinating is whatever you imagine Jesus to say, in this little exercise that you take part in just now, whatever you imagine Jesus to say probably says a lot about your assumptions about Jesus. Like, it might be worth spending some time thinking, why is it that that's the first thing that came to mind? Is that the thing I want to think of Jesus? Is that in line with the sort of things Jesus actually said? Because we can put words in his mouth sometimes, can't we? We can make Jesus to be the Jesus that we want him to be or imagine him to be. But there's a constant when we do an exercise like this, and the constant seems to be this. Jesus is so familiar to us. Particularly in Western society, we've heard him talked about so many times that often, whatever it is we do imagine Jesus might say in a situation like this, it's not that shocking. It's not that surprising. It's just kind of what we would expect. And the other thing about Jesus, which is interesting, whenever we imagine him talking, we always work from the assumption that we would understand what he was talking about, that he would be clear, and that we would be able to make sense of what he was saying. But imagine some of the surprise when Jesus gathers these people round. They're all gathered near there. You're pushing. You're trying to get a front row, not a seat, a front row standing place. Like, you're trying to get wet feet because that means you're as close to Jesus as you can get. What is Jesus going to say? And Jesus says, so there was this farmer. Like, which is not what you expect, right? I want you to try and just really wrestle with this at the minute. There was this farmer. Just recently, Jordan Peterson was in Calgary. They were selling tickets for that they started at $200 or something like that. And not that long, the former president of the United States, Obama, is coming to Calgary, and they're selling tickets for that for a few $100s. I want you to appreciate my attempt to bring in left and right in this analogy here. That would be a room to put them both in the same space, right? Imagine if you go and you're there and you're looking there and you've got yourself, maybe you spent $300 and you got a seat without an obstruction. And there's your hero, Jordan Obama. And I'm just trying to keep tracking with us. And you're seeing him there and what is he going to say? I've paid $300 for this. What is he going to say? And he walks out on stage and says, so there was this farmer once. That's not what you expect. That's not how this story is supposed to go. But this is what Jesus does all the time. He tells stories. And his stories, despite the fact that we talk about them thousands of years later, most of his stories are about 1 minute long. The biggest of them, if you read slow, take you about 5 minutes to read through. 2,000 years later, we're talking about these stories that are countable in terms of seconds. But these stories kind of stick in our minds. And it strikes me that if we're going to be followers of Jesus, if we're actually going to wrestle with what it is to be Christian, then we should pay attention to these stories. We should immerse ourselves in these stories because these are what Jesus did a lot of the time. The problem is, Jesus' stories, they're a bit awkward. They're kind of puzzling. They don't always make a lot of sense. In fact, if we're honest, and I don't know if we're allowed to say this about Jesus, it sometimes feels like he's going out of his way to make them difficult, right? And this is hard for us in contemporary society because we value clarity. We value things making sense. We value concise, clear communication. I remember when I was a younger person in seminary and we took a class in preaching, homiletics, they called it. And one of the first things they ever said to us was the golden rule of public speaking is always be really clear. Always make sure people know exactly what it is that you're talking about. Now, I didn't do too well at this class. You may have gathered that by now. But this was the golden rule. Be clear. And then we used to leave that class and we'd go into our New Testament class and we'd read about Jesus and we'd be like, man, Jesus would not do well in our preaching class. Because he is not clear. In fact, it sometimes seems like he's going out of our way to not be clear on purpose. And this parable, which actually the parable that Jesus tells here about a farmer, is one of the most important parables because it kind of sets up how you need to go about wrestling with parables. Listen, Jesus says, a farmer went out to sow his seed. This is a really normal event in an agrarian culture like the one that Jesus lives in. As he was scattering the seed, I'm doing this with some vague sense that I know what happens when you scatter seed, but maybe it's not like that at all. But Jesus says this man is scattering seed, and some fell along the path, and the birds came and they ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil, it was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched. and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell amongst thorns, which grew up and choked the plants, so they did not bear grain. And still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times. So you're there in this scene. Jesus is in the boat. His voice is carrying across the water. Your feet are at the edge of the shore because you're straining to get as near as you can to hear what this incredible teacher is going to talk about. He's throwing you a little bit because he started talking about farmers and seed. And, maybe you were hoping for kind of, the best of Greco-Roman philosophy. Maybe you're hoping that he would bring this idea that would be so clear that all of a sudden the whole world would make sense to you. You're hoping he'd just drop that moment and you would go, aha, this is all understandable. But he tells you this story about birds and rocks and seed and farmers. Okay, well, maybe he's just warming up the crowd. What is he going to do with this story, though? Because that's where it really happens, right? They tell the illustration, the preacher, the teacher, the person talking, they give you an illustration. And then the genius moment is when they take this everyday story and they just blow it up and show you how this is your everyday life. So the crowd are gathered and they're waiting and they're excited. What is Jesus going to say? To which he says, if you have ears, you should listen. And then he's done. That's it. The whole story. You gathered round to hear Jesus, and he told you a story and said, if you can hear, you probably should. That's how Jesus capitalizes on a key moment with a large crowd that want to hear what he has to say. They're here, they're waiting, they're interested, and he tells them a story and says, maybe you should listen to this, and leaves. Maybe Jesus values something other than just being clear. Maybe Jesus wants to draw you into this story. Maybe, just maybe, Jesus wants you to think for yourself about this story. Maybe Jesus wants to force us to do some reflecting and some soul searching. The kind of reflecting and soul searching that we didn't plan to do when we woke up this morning. When we turned up at the edge of the shore, we were here for something simple, something easy to eat, something kind of spoon-fed. And Jesus told us this slightly strange story and then told us that maybe we should think about listening. Now, some of the people in the crowd hate Jesus. They don't like what they hear of him. And they come and they turn up. Imagine what that's like to sit there. You hate this guy, right? You've turned up this particular day and you're like, you woke up that morning and you told your husband, I'm going to hear Jesus. Why? Because I hate him. And he's going to say stuff and I'm going to write it down and then I'm going to come home from what he said and we're going to have dinner and I'm going to complain about it. Because back in those days, that's what people did when they didn't like what the preacher said. And So you're there and you're thinking, right, I'm ready. He's going to make a theological mistake at some point and I'm going to be on it. He's going to say something offensive or politically inflammatory and I'm going to be there. I'm going to write it down and I'm going to never let him forget it. And you're there. And he starts to talk about birds and seed and soil and thorns. This man's crazy, you think. What a total waste of time. I came with my game on, ready to really object to this, and we're just telling stories about farmers. Some people hated Jesus that they were plotting to kill him. Imagine you were in that group, and they said, you're right, you got to go and get Jesus, right? You're going to listen, take notes, come back and report. Tell us what he said so that we can accuse him of being a rebel, or we can accuse him of starting a revolution, or we can get in and show that he's totally off beam and really crazy. And you come back, and the room's filled, and everyone's gathered around. What did Jesus say? I'm imagining a Monty Python type scene here at the moment, just in case if you're with me. What did he say? What did he say? And you go, well, he told a story about dirt and seed and farming. What are we going to do with that? We can't take that to the authorities. We can't come out and say, beware of this dangerous man and his farming stories. What are you going to do with that? But then there's other people there. Maybe they were healed by Jesus. Maybe they had a moment with Jesus where he revolutionized their life. Maybe he journeyed with them. Maybe he'd helped them, healed them, cared for them, helped patch them back together, stood up for them, defended them. Those people are there. And they hear this story as an invitation to ponder. an invitation to think for themselves, an invitation to think about themselves. Because the beautiful thing about Jesus and his parables is they mean different things to different people. People who think Jesus is stupid find that affirmed in these small, crazy stories. People who are open-minded, people who are willing to hear a voice other than their own. These stories are an invitation to something bigger, to something more. See, because Jesus seems to know something that sits at the bottom of all parables, but is definitely found very clearly in this parable. The truth of it is, we're not very good at listening. I don't know if you've noticed this about yourself, but there's one thing we as humans are really, really bad at, is listening. We're very good at thinking about what we want to say. And many of us find it really helpful that after we've said things, you would take some time to say some things back, because while you're saying the things back, it helps us to think about what we're going to say next. And if you can just fill the air with some noise, it takes the pressure off us to come up with something brilliant to say immediately. Have you ever been in one of those conversations where you realize, I'm not really listening to this person, I'm just waiting for my turn? It's often easier to see other people that doing it than it is to see it in our own lives. Or maybe you've been in one of those situations where you're nodding, yeah. And you realize you've become a kind of human form of those dogs that sit on dashboards that kind of just do this. Because you're just saying, yeah. And then this moment of terror hits you. Like, what if they ask me a question? Because I have no idea what we're talking about right now. And if I say yes, that could get me doing something I don't want to do. And if they say no, I could be really offensive and prove that I've not been listening. But Jesus seems to know we are not good at listening. It's difficult for us to hear a voice other than our own. In fact, I'd put it to us that perhaps the most difficult thing any of us do in any day is actually listen well. And Jesus seems to know this. So he tells these short fictional stories because they're not hard to listen to. But if you do listen to them, they start to do something in us. They're not illustrations. Jesus doesn't use these stories as illustrations to help just make sense of everything for you. He doesn't tell you these stories to clarify a point that he's making. These stories are intentionally puzzling. But in the puzzle, they invite you. They force their way into your mind. They force their way into your heart and ask you to do the hard work of thinking and listening. Robert Farrar Capon, who is brilliant in his kind of explanation and engagement with Jesus' parables, says this: Jesus did not use the parables to explain everything to people's satisfaction, but rather to call into question people's previous understandings. In other words, the parables are trying to upset people's existing ideas as well as provide them new ones. They are meant to pop every circuit breaker in people's minds. After all our yammer, and yammer is a very theologically technical word. After all our yammer and opinions about how God should or shouldn't run the world, getting people to just stand there with their eyes wide open and their mouths shut would be a giant step forward. And this is what Jesus' parables are designed to do. The writer Clarence Jordan says that Christ's parables are like witty hermeneutical hand grenades, that Jesus tosses them in as a punchline, and it's only as he's leaving the city you hear the explosions of realization of what it was that he actually just said. What if the parables of Jesus are designed to throw us off track? Because you see, these discourses, these pieces of teaching, these conversations, these stories are in one sense discourses, but also, you might say it as it has been said before, they are dash courses. They're designed to knock us off course. They're designed to take us out of the course of life that we're in and into a different one. We have our lives all figured out. We know where it's going. We know how it all works. And then Jesus tells a story that comes in sometimes like a sledgehammer, if we'll listen, knocks us right out of the road that we're going down and into a different way not just of thinking, but a different way of being. And throughout this series, this is what we want to wrestle with in these parables. Are we brave enough to hear Jesus tell the stories that might disrupt us? Are we brave enough to wrestle with these stories in different ways? To look beyond just simply asking, what do these stories mean? Which is a very Western way of thinking. Like, what's the one meaning of this parable? Explain it to me. But parables aren't always about finding the one meaning. They're about the wrestle. They're about the engagement. They're about finding what's unexpected in that. Because parables are Jesus putting the ball in your court and asking you, what does it mean to you? How do you make sense of this? How does this parable sink down into your own life and change things and challenge things and push things? Parable literally means, this Greek word parabole literally means to throw down beside. So Jesus dumps these parables. Look, there you go. And one of the questions you're supposed to ask is, like, what is this doing here? When you read the Gospels, you're supposed to get to a parable and go, what on earth is trying to be said here? It's just been thrown there. It kind of feels, it's not well placed sometimes. The story's kind of weird. Sometimes the stories they're not that great, right? Some of the parables, they're not impressive pieces of oratory. They're not hugely clever. But it's in that apparent feebleness that their power is found. Because the power of a parable isn't just in the story. It's in the one who hears it and chooses to listen to it. It's in the person who takes that parable and says, what is this parable trying to do in me? Because the parable wants to ask the same question all the time. So are you listening? And it's difficult to listen if you think you know what's being said. It's difficult to hear Jesus sometimes because we assume we know what the parable means. And because we think we know what the parable means, we move on without reading it. Churches across the centuries have done a terrible thing to parables, and that has been, we've told them as children's stories. And we tell them all the time in our children's churches, but we don't wrestle with them in our own lives. But Jesus wasn't telling stories to children. He was telling stories to anyone who would listen. And the riddle, the puzzle, the complexity of the parable is where its power is found. So after telling this story and the crowds have dispersed, the disciples come to Jesus and they say in the way that the disciples generally do, like, Jesus, what on earth was that about? That sense that many of us know deeply, that sense of sitting and listening to a sermon and going home and somebody says, what was the sermon about? And you say, I have no idea. Well, Jesus tells this story and he tells people to listen and the people go home and the disciples come to Jesus and they go, Jesus, like, what was that? And Jesus replies, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you. But to those on the outside, everything's said in parables so that, and then he quotes Isaiah, they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, ever hearing but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. To which Jesus' disciples say, yeah, still no idea what you're talking about there, Jesus. That really didn't clear things up for me at all. In fact, maybe I'm a little further away from understanding it now. Who is this they that Jesus is talking about? Well, is it anyone that might listen? Because there's all these different types of people come to listen to Jesus with different motives for being there, with different reasons as to why they're stood in Jesus' company. Some people are open to Jesus. And if you're open to Jesus, parables invite you closer. They invite you in. They invite you into a kingdom life that will be revolutionary but disrupting, that will be painful but filled with hope. But if you're not open to Jesus, Jesus says these parables will seemingly come across idiotic and stupid and pointless. And you might just become more closed down, step further away, that what little you had ends up being taken from you. And Jesus is saying this isn't new. This has always been the way it's been with God. That there's an invitation to listen, and you don't have to listen. But your attitude and your approach will affect what you take from it. Apparently Jesus, who knows that it's difficult for us to listen, wants us as his followers to cultivate the art of being open-minded, to have open ears, to never be comfortable with our understanding of Jesus. Because the thing is this, we like to think we've got Jesus figured out, but there's this strange thing that Jesus is hinting towards us at. And that says once you think you've got Jesus figured out, once you think you've got a firm grasp of him, that's generally the point in which you stop listening. That's when you stop paying attention. It's when you stop wrestling with what it is that he's trying to say. Do you have ears? So parables force us to rethink about ourselves. They force us to rethink the world around us. They force us to rethink the journey that we're part of. But they make us do that work because Jesus wants us to ask, are we listening? Amy Jill Levine, in her little book on Jesus' parable, says this: religion has been defined as designed to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. We do well to think of the parables of Jesus as doing the afflicting. Therefore, if we hear a parable and think, I really like that, or worse, fail to take any challenge, we're not listening well enough. Such listening is not only a challenge, it is also an art, and this art has become lost. What we're not trying to do in this series is domesticate these stories. We're trying to listen to them, have open ears to them, to allow them to be as provocative as they were in Jesus' time, to allow these stories to disrupt us and knock us off track. So Jesus says to them, don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? See, because this parable is about the different responses that you might have to Jesus. We call it the parable of the sower, but it's not really about the sower. It's not even really about seed. It's about soil. It's about what happens where this seed lands. This parable seems to be about what it is to be open to what Jesus is trying to say. So there's 4 different types of soil that this seed lands upon. And what if this parable can do for us in the 21st century what it seemed to want to do in the first century? Essentially, it seems that there's a question Jesus wants you to ask. Which soil am I? And not that you find that soil that you are and then remain trapped there, but to ask and wrestle with the question, am I here? Am I happy that I'm here? And how might I be somewhere else if this is not where I want to be? The farmer sows the word, Jesus continues. Some people are like seed along the path where the word is sown. As soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in them. So there's a person, Jesus says, and they are not in the place to receive Jesus and his kingdom message. They just can't take it in. There's nowhere for this kingdom message to grow. Perhaps they're closed down. Perhaps they've shut down their mind. Perhaps they think it's irrelevant. But the thing is this, Jesus says this leaves you in a precarious position because you can't have no opinion on this. Your opinion either is to lean into it or lean away from it. And if you lean away from it, there's something else which you become open to. And Jesus describes that as Satan. He describes that as evil. He describes that as something other than his kingdom. And you might be in that place and you might not care. And that might be okay for you. You might decide, I'm not interested in any of this whole religious stuff. But what if you do care? What if you are in that place and realize the soil is not good that you're in? Can you hear what Jesus is saying and step into that? Others, Jesus said, are like seed sown on rocky places. They hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. So this person hears God's gospel. He hears the kingdom message. They lean into it. She is excited about what it is that God can do. The problem is, this is like people that follow Jesus on Instagram. One of my favorite memes, it's a little sacrilegious, but there's this picture, it's Jesus, and he's sat on a log, and there's a guy sat next to him, and the guy sat next to him is kind of looking at his phone like this, and the caption underneath just simply says this, it's Jesus speaking. He says, no, I meant actually follow me. And you see, we follow Jesus with our words, and we can follow Jesus with the things that we say, and we can associate with him. But what about when something difficult happens? When life throws one of those curveballs at you, or when you're at work one day and somebody says, you're not one of those crazy people that believe in religious stuff. You're not one of those people that think about God and Jesus and all that sort of thing. How do you respond to that? Are you embarrassed about your association with Jesus? Because that's sometimes what it appears like to have no root. Maybe that's some of us. Do you have ears? Still others, Jesus said, like seed sown among thorns, hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. See, so this is not about shallowness, this type of situation. It's just that the main thing growing in our life isn't Jesus. There's competition. There's other ideas. There's other notions out there that are fighting for the space in the soil. And Jesus wants to lean into this thought about what if he's the primary thing? What if he's the only thing? What if he's the one thing growing? So this sort of situation, it's not necessarily about what I say, but it's about the choices that I make. What do I do with my time? How do I spend my energy? What do I invest my finance into? Perhaps there are different issues driving my life, and they're fighting for space. And these things are the thorns that would choke it out. And maybe that's some of us. Others, Jesus says, are like a seed sown on good soil. They hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop, some 30, some 60, some 100 times what was sown. It's because when you let Jesus in, you devote yourself to him. You decide that he's going to be the thing that you wrestle with, that his teachings are going to be the struggle that you ponder over, think about, and listen to. What happens is you produce a crop. And think about that word produce. It's not that you just start to think differently. It's not that your mindset is just simply different. But actually what you get is this sense that the parables are trying to do something in your life which changes not just how you think, but how you live. That all things will change, that you will work out this message. So the parable seems to ask us this simple question. What category are you in? The discourse of the parable of the sower is to sometimes realize that we're not in the category we thought we were in. That if we'll take time to listen to a very simple story about a farmer and some seed and some soil, we'll realize that where we thought we were might not be where we are. Maybe we were one place and we've moved. Maybe we've drifted. Maybe we found ourselves somewhere that we didn't anticipate. But this parable invites us into the wrestle and asks us to think about where we are. The parable asks us, do we have ears? Which is an important question because we're terrible listeners. So this parable invites you to wrestle. And that's my invitation to you this week. Wrestle with this parable. Wrestle with other parables. It's not that we come to a context like this and say, what does this parable mean? But we simply ask, what can this parable do if I might listen to it? So I don't want to unpack it anymore. I want to leave that to you. I want the parable to irritate you a little bit, to churn at you somewhat, to bug you. It's okay to be mad at this parable. It's okay to be slightly irritated by its offense. These are all normal responses to parables. But let me end with a poem. Emily Dickinson says this: tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Perhaps appropriate to think about parables, Dickinson tells us that we should always tell the truth, as Jesus does. But he tells it in a kind of round-the-housies way, a way that requires you to go over and over and over it again, because perhaps the truth is a little too shocking for us, and we need time to wrestle it, to work on it, to let it change us and slowly move into our hearts and shape us. So my prayer for you this morning is the prayer I pray for myself in a series on parables. Simply this: may you have ears and may you hear. And may God's grace and peace be with you. God bless. 10,000